So welcome to Spectrum's Personality Disorder and Complex Trauma Echo. My name is Dimi, Head of Workforce Development, and the team, including Eve and Liv, coordinate these echo sessions. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge any First Australians who may be present. We also acknowledge people with lived and living experience of mental ill health and recovery and the experience of those who support them, including carers and families. The voice of people with lived and living experience inform our work. Now, for our presentation today, I would like to welcome Tanya Gillmartin from CEED, who will provide a presentation on understanding disordered eating in the context of personality disorders. Tanya is a senior clinical psychologist who works with the Victorian Centre for Excellence in Eating Disorders to help strengthen the Victorian service system to help individuals with eating disorders. She also has an extensive history working with individuals who have personality disorders from a DBT and RODBT, or radically open, framework. That Tanya is passionate about understanding the co-occurrence of personality disorders and eating disorders and is involved with Monash University to examine this area. So welcome, Tanya. Over to you. I'm looking forward to the presentation.
Thank you so much, and so glad to have everyone joining us. I will just get my slides back to the start. And I suppose as a brief intro, this is going to be an extremely brief introduction. This is an area I could talk about for a very long period of time. So this is just a bit of a taste. And a lot of these slides are also cherry-picked from a presentation I did with Julian at Spectrum a couple of years ago. So if you are wanting a little bit more, there is a full hour webinar on the CEED website. So for those who haven't come across CEED before, CEED is the Victorian Centre for Excellence in Eating Disorder. And we're a statewide service just like Spectrum, but our focus is on eating disorders. We don't have a clinical arm, but we do a lot of case consultations, service development. We have heaps of trainings. We've got a couple of trainings every month on different parts of working with eating disorders, as well as a very extensive resource library on our website. So if this is inspiring anyone today, please check out our website and ask us any questions if you're interested. So the first question to ask when, I'm coming here talking to a lot of people with an interest in personality disorders is, why should we think about these together? Well, because sometimes an eating disorder is just an eating disorder. And I've, of course, got just in inverted commas because it is still a very serious mental illness. We know that anorexia, unfortunately, holds the award of the most deadly mental illness. So when I say just an eating disorder, I certainly am not diminishing the severity and the concern associated with it. We know we're mostly talking about anorexia, bulimia, and binge eating disorder today, but there are other eating disorders that we do need to keep in mind. And it is a disturbance of eating behavior, which impairs our psychosocial functioning. And the core things about these are their sense of value is really associated with the control of eating on shape or of eating. So the wording of that's a bit funny, but we know that the general presentation of eating disorder is someone who's really concerned about their appearance, and their sense of self is really relied on weight and shape. But there is quite a substantial number of people with an eating disorder that it's really focused on the control of it. So I need to do this to feel in control. If I don't eat this, I'm going to lose control. So it's control and control of weight and shape. That's paired with the disturbed eating habits, so the extreme restriction of food or the binge eating or other compensatory behaviours. And that's the other weight control things there as well. So when we sort of think about what an eating disorder is, thinking a little bit away from those diagnostic criteria and thinking about some of those components are going to be an important part of understanding how this relates to personality disorders. This is a really basic one. I'm not expecting everyone to memorize this, but it's sort of a bit of a model about how eating disorders arise from body dissatisfaction. We all live on this culture or this society which is very appearance focused. But it's when that turns into what we call weight bias internalization, or the expectation that we need to look a certain way in order to succeed in life or to be liked, where that dissatisfaction comes out, and the leading of that to dieting and disordered eating. So we know that this is the general process in which someone may develop an eating disorder. The other really important thing that I need to touch on when I talk about eating disorders is the influence of starvation. We know that when someone is starved or they're malnourished, it has a massive impact on our functioning and the way our brain works. So the Minnesota experiment was conducted way back in the 40s. And what they found is that these men, they were starved for 6 months. And I use inverted commas because they ate 1,600 calories, which is a lot more than most diets these days, but it was still a starvation for them. And it had a huge impact on their physical abilities, their cognitive abilities. They became more obsessive, more rigid, more anxious, more depressed. And that was a really significant finding in this. This might seem a little out of place, but I will tie this in a minute. And this is sort of a brief summary of the impacts of that. Another couple of interesting ones is the social changes there. People weren't able to, go to a movie and enjoy it. They didn't have a sense of humor. They weren't able to work as a group. It impacted their relationships and every other part of their life. Huge medical risk associated with eating disorders as well. And most people know this. Like I said, it's unfortunately the most deadly mental health concern. And that's both through starvation and malnutrition, as well as purging and laxative misuse, which are incredibly risky. So I'm going to bring this back to the very start. Sometimes an eating disorder is just an eating disorder, but sometimes there's a hell of a lot more going on underneath. And that's, I think, the big part about this presentation and this introduction is that the eating, the dieting, the purging, concerns about weight loss, all of this model that I showed you just a moment ago on about body dissatisfaction, that's all a very significant part of the eating disorder. But the reality is we know that there's often something else that's driving that. It's personality disorder, it's autism, general loneliness. We know that the actual presentation is sometimes just the tip of the iceberg. When it comes to eating disorders and personality disorders, we know that the prevalence rates between those is 30% to 75%. That's a huge range, but regardless of whether you go with the low end or the high end of that range, it's much higher than the general population. And we know that personality pathology is evident before the development of an eating disorder and exists after its remission. So even if someone is presenting with an eating disorder, there is a chance that personality disturbance occurred first and may be the driving factor. So in some cases, quite a lot of cases, if you look at those stats, it's really driven by underlying personality pathology. So what do we do with this? First of all, let's understand some of the patterns. This is sort of taken from a couple of meta-analyses that have been conducted, and there are a lot of exceptions to this rule. But generally, we find that the highest co-occurring personality disorders among anorexia, restrictive subtype, and binge eating disorder are avoidant and obsessive compulsive personality disorders. So much more likely to be those traditional cluster C. And we know that anorexia, binge, purge subtype and bulimia are more likely to be associated with borderline personality and paranoid personality. Again, like I said, there are a lot of exceptions to this, but there are some general themes that we really notice. And that the couple of boxes right over on the right-hand side summarize why we think that that's the case. Some of those personality traits that might be specifically related to some of the behaviors with those eating disorders. So when we think about how to work with these together and how to conceptualize these disorders together, I like to think both of these sections. So first of all, as I said, in a lot of cases, I believe the personality pathology is driving the eating behavior, basically because it was there first. The consequences of adequate nutrition will then just exacerbate the personality disturbance, but it was still there first. So it's really important to consider these together, as opposed to saying, let's treat you for your personality disorder, then treat you for your eating disorder. The reality is that they're working together, so they may as well be considered together. And it's also important in this to understand how they work together. You know, how is the eating disorder functioning to manage the emotions? You know, is it a part of the rigidity? Is it a compulsive need to feel in control, or is it an impulsive reaction to emotional stress? Sometimes people will engage in disordered eating behavior when they can't self-harm or when they're trying not to self-harm. Alternatively, some people will self-harm because they feel so much shame about binge eating or purging. So again, it's understanding how these behaviors work together and how their diagnoses may fit together. Is it a form of communicating? Is it a sense of low self-esteem? I've noticed I've had a lot of clients who clearly have, say, OCPD or avoidant personality, that they've been told they've got BPD because they're so suicidal, whereas they're so suicidal because they're miserable, because they hate their life, because their eating disorder sucks, and because they've got OCPD. So there's some really interesting patterns that really come out here that it's important to just question or be aware of. On the other hand, as I said, the eating behavior and malnutrition is going to have a huge impact on personality. So when we're starved, even if I don't eat my lunch as early as I'd like to, I become cranky, I become angry, I can't focus. I had to do something recently and I was told food would be supplied and they didn't supply morning tea. Between 11:30 and 12:30, I could not remember what I was meant to be saying. I kept looking down at my script and then looking up and forgetting what I'd just read. My brain was all over the place. Imagine doing that for a couple of weeks or a couple of months and the impact that's going to have on our ability to communicate, to connect. And we see that even more so with eating disorders, and imagining how that might interact if you also have a lot of difficulties with managing emotions, cognition, memory, and all those sort of things anyway. So it's important to keep in mind how malnutrition might be affecting your ability or your client's ability to manage their stuff. So how to work together with them together in a nutshell. Like I said, I think I need to do a full day on this, but treat the conditions together. Doesn't make sense to separate them out. They're so well closely entwined, so you might as well work with them together. And within this, really considering that medical instability, is really high priority. Like I said, it's very deadly. So if we're thinking within, say, for example, a DBT treatment hierarchy, when we might want to put risk first, if someone's starved, if someone's purging every day, that's going to be something that's going to go right to the top of the hierarchy, because it's something that can lead to hospitalization and death. So it's very important to keep in mind the potential medical instability. And target regular eating. Treating an eating disorder or treating a personality disorder is really difficult. I sort of say it's like pushing a boulder. And then add starvation, and then now pushing that boulder uphill, because it's making people more emotionally dysregulated, more rigid, more angry, or whatever it is that's going on. So trying to bring in regular eating and manage some of those eating processes are important early on. Otherwise, it just makes it all so much harder. And then you can treat the personality disorder and the personality stuff as the maintaining factor behind that. This isn't the way that clients like for it to be done, and it's certainly not the way that services like to do it. But I suppose from a scientific perspective, dealing with the starvation and malnutrition is really necessary as a first point of call. The other quick tip I'll sort of give is establishing non-negotiables are super important to try and help people come in and stay safe. So sort of saying, this is what we're expecting of you in order to receive treatment. And that's going to be different for everyone, but in most cases it involves going to your GP, having medical monitoring, trying to keep some sort of stability with your physical state, because we can't treat someone when they're going in and out of hospital all the time. It just doesn't work very well. So trying to help people gain some medical stability is often a really important non-negotiable to have. really quickly on treatments, there's very limited information about treatments of co-occurring personality disorders and eating disorders. But the general recommended treatments for eating disorders are family-based treatment for young people, and then cognitive behavioral therapy for adults. And there are other versions of that underneath as well. When they're put together, there are some adaptations that suggest there's evidence that binge eating and bulimia can be treated through DBT. MBT, there's some adaptations for eating disorders, but the RCT found that it sort of was quite equal to SSCM, which is a treatment of eating disorder. So we're not too sure how effective that is over and above standard SSCM. Schema therapy has research for eating disorders, but it's very limited. RODBT has research that's effective for personality disorders or eating disorders separately, but again, still really early days, and similar with ACT, but there's nothing out there which says, hey, this is the go-to. And then there's some resources to consider. So thank you very much.